To get us started, we're going to begin with a scenario to help put us in the proper mindset for our installation. Typically, when you're learning new applications or servers, you might be doing so without a goal, without something to direct you in your learning. By having a scenario in mind, it can really help you to feel like you have a destination, as opposed to simply learning facts and features abstractly. So our scenario for this series involves a company called Globomantics. Now this is a US-based securities brokerage house founded by Hank Richardson in 1979. They have their headquarters in New York with branch offices in Chicago and Dallas, but they're expanding. Although they are a US-based company, they have many clients abroad, and so Globomantics will begin establishing offices in other countries in the near future. In planning for that expansion, they've decided to bring their Exchange solution in-house. Currently, they have a hosted solution, so they've decided to go with Exchange 2010, and initially they want the basic email functionality that they had with their hosted solution. Their hosted solution also provides protection from spam and virus attacks, and so they'd like that functionality included as well. And they've heard about the high availability and unified messaging features in Exchange, so they're thinking about ways to implement these features going forward. So these are features that we're going to discuss a little further down the line. Now, one of the first things you want to do before you install anything is map out a design. And you cannot design anything until you take stock of the existing infrastructure. So when it comes to Globomantics, you've performed an initial review of their existing infrastructure just to get your bearings. You note that they have a single Active Directory domain called globomantics.com. There are 2 domain controllers in each site. One of those servers is a global catalog server, and so you have 3 sites, so you have a total of 6 different domain controllers and 3 global catalog servers. You can see here that the forest root domain is located in New York, and you note that all existing servers are running on x86 hardware, so they're a little bit dated. You're going to have to keep that in mind when it comes to what you're going to install Exchange on. And you know that users have all been upgraded to Outlook 2007, and at the current time, all use the hosted Exchange solution provided by a company called HostX. That is going to change very soon. So the plan to start with is to install a single Exchange server at the main headquarters in New York City. You're going to use 4 of the Exchange server roles on that server: the Hub Transport, Client Access Server, Mailbox Server, and Unified Messaging Server. Being that Exchange cannot be installed on any of the x86 systems because it requires an x64 architecture, you're going to have to purchase a new system. We're going to talk about some of the requirements for that in a moment. Once that first server is in place, once you've installed Exchange and everything is up and running properly, we can then discuss at a later time additional features that you may want to add on. Features that may add to your disaster recovery or high availability solutions. So our initial server configuration will look something like this. We'll begin with a new server that meets the hardware requirements that we'll review in a moment. We'll use Server 2008 R2 Enterprise Edition as our operating system, and we'll install Exchange 2010 Enterprise Edition. You can see here that we have a name chosen for the computer, the IP address is mapped out, you can see we already have some of the hardware requirements there in place. It's always a good idea to map out very clearly what you're going to be implementing in your organization. Keep in mind that the potential still exists that we will implement additional servers at some future point in time, once we have the first one in place and functional. So we'll get this server up and running, and then we'll talk about the implementation of additional servers that we may want to put into play at some point in the future. Now, in case you're wondering, why did we choose Server 2008 R2 as our operating system? And then why did we choose the Enterprise Edition? And then why did we choose the Enterprise Edition of Exchange Server 2010? Not to worry, all will be made clear in good time. Now, if we were going to break down the installation steps, we might break them down into 5 different steps. The first is make sure you have the proper hardware in place. The second is confirm that you have the right server operating system, with service packs installed if they are required. The third is update your Active Directory schema to support the new Exchange install. The fourth is install all prerequisite software. And finally, install your Exchange server roles. And so those are the 5 steps we're going to focus on so that we can get our Exchange server up and running. Typically, when you're looking to purchase and implement hardware in your environment, in your server environment, you have quite a bit of flexibility. There's quite a bit of latitude in terms of the vendor you go with, as well as in terms of the features of that server. The processor, the memory, the disk space, these are things that typically have flexibility. But that flexibility becomes a bit more narrowed down when you start looking into implementing Exchange Server 2010. For example, the processor requires x64 architecture, so that can be Intel or AMD 64 as far as your platform's concerned. You cannot use legacy x86 systems. So in our globomantic situation, where we only have x86 systems, obviously it puts us in a position where we have to purchase a new server. And from an administrative perspective, that's a welcome thing, really, so long as we have the budget for it. We're always excited to get new, latest and greatest type hardware and software, so that's a good thing. So we're going to get a system that's x64 based. Now, as for the memory, it really depends on the role that's installed. But more memory never hurts a server. The more memory you can get, the better. The minimum per server is 4 gigabytes. The minimum, if you're combining roles, is 8 gigabytes. So in our situation, we're looking at combining 4 different roles. At the same time, you have to consider adding 2 to 10 megabytes per mailbox. So if we're looking at how much memory to put on a system, it really depends on the number of roles that you're combining, and if it's a mailbox server, the number of mailboxes. So we can start figuring that out and adding it all up. In our case, we're going to go with a standard 16 gigabyte server. Now, as for disk space, the most important is the mailbox role. Typically, the other servers don't utilize a great deal of disk space, but obviously if you're going to have mailboxes, and depending on whether or not you're going to use quota limitations, that mailbox can grow and grow and grow. In Exchange 2010, there's really no problem with a mailbox being 8, 9, 10 gigabytes in size, and even larger. So disk space is a big concern. You need 1.2 gigabytes to install Exchange, which really is nothing. That's not even something you need to really plan for. If you're running unified messaging, you need an additional 500 megabytes for each language pack. You need an additional 500 megabytes for the queue databases, for the edge transport or hub transport server. But really, when it comes to disk space, you're not going to really have to worry when it comes to all of the other server roles. The big one is the mailbox server role. So how do you calculate that? Well, you can do it manually, or you can go to the Microsoft Exchange Team website. There's a calculator that actually is perfect for helping you to figure out what amount of disk space you're going to need, not only for your present environment, but also thinking about future growth. So as you start to compile a list of ideas, you think about your processor, your memory, your disk space. What about some of the other features to that server? Well, here's the thing. Any server that you purchase is going to have a network connection logically. It's going to have the ability to display on a screen, whatever kind of monitor you're looking to connect that up to. These are all very basic requirements. So when it comes to those items, just make sure that the server is able to run either Server 2008 or Server 2008 R2. If the server is certified for those 2 server operating systems and all of the little features involved like the network connection or your monitor connection, if you have certified drivers that will run with Server 2008 or 2008 R2, then you should be good to go, so long as you followed all the other advice as far as making sure processor memory and disk space matches up with your server roles. Now, once that server arrives, and that's an exciting day when you get that new server in, well, obviously you're going to have to install the right operating system on top of that server. So be careful. You can still install a 32-bit operating system on an x64-based server. So remember to install the 64-bit version of Server 2008 or Server 2008 R2. In addition, make sure to choose the full install only. You may accidentally choose the server core version of the server when you're doing the installation, but keep in mind, Exchange will not run on server core. So we want the 64-bit edition of server, and we want to make sure that we have a full installation. Now, as far as the kinds of operating systems we can install, we want to install either Windows Server 2008 Standard Edition or Enterprise Edition Service Pack 2. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I already have one of these operating systems installed, but we haven't installed Service Pack 2 yet? Well, you have to install Service Pack 2 or you're not going to get the installation to work properly. Now in our case, we're going with a brand new server. So rather than go with a legacy operating system, we're going to go with the latest and greatest, Windows Server 2008 R2. There's Standard and there's Enterprise Edition. Why are we going with the Enterprise Edition when it comes to our Globomantics rollout? Well, the Enterprise Edition includes various features that we may want to include later on. For example, it has failover clustering features. So in the event in the future, as we discuss high availability options for our Exchange 2010 server, if we want to extend our server and go with some of these high availability options, we're going to want to have the failover clustering features. Now that's not to say we're going to implement a cluster with Exchange 2010. One of the nice things about Exchange 2010 is that we don't have to literally dive into the failover clustering features and set up the cluster. However, we're going to need those features to be on the server so that Exchange can take advantage of them. No need to get too stressed out about this just yet. We're going to cover this later on. But that's why we're going to use the Enterprise Edition when it comes to our Globomantics rollout. If you're using any one of these other operating systems, that is great, so long as it's 64-bit, and in the case of 2008, so long as it's Service Pack 2 compliant, or if you're using R2, in all of these cases, you're going to be able to install Exchange 2010. Now, as for the management tools, it requires 64-bit Vista, Service Pack 2, or later, which means Windows 7, and so on. Now we've talked about the hardware, we've talked about the server operating system. The next step in the process of the 5 steps that we mentioned earlier is taking care of your Active Directory schema and preparing your domain. So what is the Active Directory schema to start with? Well, you might consider it like the blueprint for all of your objects and attributes within Active Directory. So when you go to create a user object, for example, that user object may contain various attributes like the user's name, the department that it works in, perhaps telephone numbers. All of those attributes are connected to that user object. Well, how does Active Directory know when you go to create a user that it needs to include those items, as opposed to when you go to create a group, it won't ask for an address for that group? How does it know the difference? Well, it's all part of the Active Directory schema or blueprint for objects and attributes. Now, these objects and attributes are going to change slightly with the installation of Exchange 2010. Now you might be thinking, oh yes, I remember updating the schema back when I installed Exchange 2003 or Exchange 2007. Well, with each upgrade in the Exchange messaging system, there are also some changes and tweaks to the Active Directory schema. So you're going to have to update the schema again. So one of the things you're going to want to keep in mind if you're going to update the schema is that you're going to want to do this on a system that's located in the site where the Active Directory schema master is located. This is a special server that's running what they call the FSMO role, which is the single master operation role. If you've studied Active Directory in the past, you know that this is a special domain controller that is holding the rights to that schema. So you're going to want to not only be in that site, but have the user account that has the permissions that can adjust the schema and make changes to it. Now, you might be thinking, I don't recall ever doing this in the past, updating my schema, but I've installed Exchange. So you might ask the question, do I need to update the schema? Well, not in smaller environments, unless it's a policy point for your particular organization. There's a policy in place that says, before we do any rollouts that involve schema updates, we're going to update the schema first, and then we'll do the rollout. So in the event you don't have a policy like that, and you have a small environment, you can actually install Exchange, and the installation will update the schema at the same time that the installation is taking place. So you're not going to see an option if you're installing Exchange that says install schema now. No, it doesn't do that. But again, in a smaller environment with no policy in place for this, you can just run the Exchange installation and it will update the schema without you even being involved. But if you do have to manually get involved, how do you update the schema? Well, you would use the command line. The commands are actually connected back to the setup files for your Exchange server. So you would navigate through your command line to the location of your setup file, and then from there you would type in setup / and then depending on what you're looking to accomplish, you can do this in bulk or you can do this in pieces. So for starters, you might type setup / prepare legacy exchange permissions. Now you would run this if you have legacy exchange servers in your environment. In our case, we don't. So do we need to run this switch? Not really. However, one thing to keep in mind is that if we run the setup / prepare schema or setup / prepare Active Directory or AD, well, those switches will automatically run the prepare legacy exchange permission switch anyway. So we don't have to give too much thought to whether or not we want to or don't want to run the prepare legacy exchange permission switch. We can run that switch, we can run the next switch, prepare schema, and then the next switch, prepare AD. Now, if you want to just cut to the chase here and you don't want to run 3 switches, that's okay. If you run setup / prepare AD, or as you can see there's alternatives, setup / P, well, that will update your schema for you in one switch. In addition to updating the schema, you need to prepare the domain where you're going to be installing your Exchange server. Now in our situation, we have a very simple domain structure, and we're installing the server right in the forest root domain. So that's where we would prepare our domain. From a command line, you would type setup / prepare domain, and that would be pretty simple. But if you need to indicate the domain that you're going to be preparing, you would type setup / prepare domain, and then provide the domain's FQDN, which is the fully qualified domain name. If you have multiple domains and you plan on installing Exchange servers in all of those domains, well, then you can just type setup / prepare all domains. So a very simple way to accomplish both tasks is to update the schema using the setup / prepare AD switch, and to update all of your domains using the setup / prepare all domains. It doesn't hurt anything to have the domains prepared for a future deployment of Exchange. So even if you're planning on installing Exchange, let's say in our case, in the New York domain, well, there's other domains perhaps. We can use prepare all domains, and all of them will be prepared for some future time. Now, even though in our situation we may not necessarily have to run these switches, let's take a look at our Exchange server, and let's run these switches anyway just to get the ball rolling and let you see how these switches would be run in the event you do have a policy that forces you to run the schema and domain preparation switches before installing the server. Okay, so here we are on our server running Server 2008 R2. You can see we already have an administrative command prompt open, and we're going to use that to type in our setup command. You recall that we can type in the commands individually, but we're just going to run the prepare AD switch so that it kicks off all of the preparations for the schema, and then we'll run the prepare all domains switch so that all of the domains in our organization are updated at the same time. Now I have my files located under Documents, and that's because I had an exe file that I expanded out. It said, where do you want to put these? I said, let's put it right into Documents. That was my choice. That doesn't have to be your choice. You can put those files anywhere you like. In fact, in your situation, you may have an ISO file that you're using that you're mounted up to, or you could be connected up to a network share where the files are located. So everyone's situation is going to be a little bit different. In this situation, the setup file is located right here, and if I right-click that file, you'll notice I don't get a great deal in terms of options here, but if I hold the Shift key down and right-click, then you'll note I can click Copy as Path. Now I can use that by going back to my command prompt, and I'm going to change the directory to go to this path. I'm actually going to take it back from the command, and now that I'm actually located right here under the proper folder, which in your case may be different, now I can run the setup command. So I'm going to run setup / prepare AD, which will do all of the work of the other switches, the preparing legacy exchange permissions as well as the prepare schema switch, and it's all wrapped up into one. Now the only thing that we have to keep in mind here is that being that this is the first installation, there's no Exchange organization container. located within our domain. So in that case, we have to specify an organization name by using the organization name parameter. So we pretty much just type in organization name, colon, and then type in the name of the organization, which in this case is going to be Globomantics. And we hit enter. Now you notice it says welcome to Microsoft Exchange Server unattended setup. And it says if we don't want to continue forward and accept the licensing terms, we can hit any key to cancel the setup. So in this case, we're going to let things just continue to run. It says no key presses were detected. Setup will continue. Preparing Exchange setup. The files have been copied. You notice that it tells us that it has not been able to detect any Exchange 2007 server roles in our environment, and that after this operation is complete, we won't be able to install any Exchange 2007 server roles. This can take a while, so we're going to stop the recording for a moment, and we'll come back as soon as it finishes. And we're back. You can see we're right at the 99% point here. And we're all done. It says the Microsoft Exchange Server setup operation completed successfully. So now the next part to our configuration is preparing the domain. So what we can do here is hit the up arrow, and you see it puts us right back here. Instead, we'll type in prepare all domains, which we don't really have to do this because there's only one domain. We hit enter. And again, it says that by not hitting any extra keys, that we're agreeing to the license terms. Okay, and that's all there is to it. You can see that it did the organization check, it prepared the domain. So at this point, we've run all of the switches that we need to, and we can proceed with the actual installation of Exchange. And we're back. So here we're going to take a look at the prerequisites for Exchange 2010. The planning that's involved with getting all of your prerequisites in place will vary depending on whether or not you're using Server 2008 Service Pack 2 or Server 2008 R2. Now you might say, well, why is that? Well, it's very simple. Because Server 2008 R2 is the later release, the server team implemented features that you need for Exchange 2010. For example, PowerShell version 2 is automatically included in the R2 release of Server 2008, as opposed to Server 2008 SP2, which does not automatically install PowerShell. Another thing to take note of is that Server 2008 SP2 uses the Server Manager command through a command prompt, as opposed to in Server 2008 R2, you use the Add Windows feature commandlet in PowerShell. So when thinking about prerequisites, we're going to have to keep in mind what server operating system we're looking at here. Another thing to keep in mind is the prerequisites for your Exchange roles. Depending on which role you'll be installing, that will determine what items you may have to configure on the server. For example, the Unified Messaging role requires the Desktop Experience feature to be installed. If you're not working with Unified Messaging, you don't have to install the Desktop Experience feature. Although personally, I recommend that you install it anyway because it does make for a little bit better working environment if you're going to be working with the server. But some people prefer that gritty look to their servers, so it's completely up to you, unless you're running the role on that system. Now, even though in our installation we're going to be working with Server 2008 R2, it's important for us to review the prerequisites for those who are going to be installing on Server 2008 SP2. For example, you're going to have to install the Microsoft.NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1. You're going to need to install the .NET Framework 3.5 Family Update as well. You're going to need to install Windows Remote Management WinRM 2.0. you'll need to install PowerShell version 2. Now, some of these items you'll be able to find by starting your Exchange installation, and it will provide you with links in order to locate some of these items. Other items you may have to go searching for. When it comes to the Hub Transport and Mailbox servers, you're going to want to install the Microsoft Filter Pack. And then depending on the installation, if you're doing a typical installation, then you would want to start an elevated command prompt, and from the scripts folder, which you would have to navigate to that folder in the command prompt, you would type the following: sc config net TCP port sharing start equals auto. What this is going to do is start the TCP port sharing service automatically. You can do that manually if you like, but it's a lot easier to do it right from the command prompt. Another thing that's easier to do from the command prompt is to use the Server Manager command with the exchange-typical XML file to help you to configure your server. What this file does is go through and install all the little features that you're going to need if you're going to perform a typical installation. So you might be thinking, well, what little features? What if I wanted to do this manually? Well, you need to install IIS if you're going to be running a client access server, for example. And so that will come with certain little features that you're going to need to turn on. All of these items you can do manually, or in the case of Server 2008 SP2, you can use the XML file. Another item that you want to make sure you have installed, as we mentioned earlier, is the desktop experience. If you use Server Manager command -I desktop-experience, well, that will install this feature. So if you're installing Exchange 2010 on a server running 2008 SP2, you're going to have to remember to install all of these different items. Otherwise, your installation may not go as planned. Or, let's be frank, it may not go forward at all. So make sure you have a list of these things that you're going to need to make sure you do before you do the installation. Well, is it any easier when it comes to using Server 2008 R2? A little bit, although it looks bigger, doesn't it? On the slide here, it looks a little bit bigger than the other one. Well, there's a reason for that. For starters, if you're going to use Server 2008 R2, you're still going to need to install the Microsoft Filter Pack. So there's no way of getting around that, and we're going to show you how to do that. But then, from PowerShell, you're going to import a module, a Server Manager module. And then from there, you're going to use the add-Windows feature commandlet. Now again, you can go and manually install these various features, but here you can see this is a much faster way to get all of your features installed. Here you can see a lot of the features that you're installing relate to web services, whether it's authentication features that have to be included, or if you're going to have RPC over HTTP proxy. You'll also note that we can install the desktop experience, which is only necessary if you're going to be installing the unified messaging role, which in our case we are. So instead of working through an XML file, when you're installing Exchange on Server 2008 R2, you can use this commandlet in order to accomplish all of the tasks that you need. And once you're done, you're going to use PowerShell to use the set service net TCP port sharing startup type automatic command in order to make sure that that TCP port service is set to automatically start. Okay, so you want to imagine that your options for installation are like a journey with multiple paths. Depending on which path you choose, you're going to have different things that you're going to need to worry about. So here you can see if you have Server 2008 SP2, you have one set of things that you have to worry about, as opposed to if you're going with R2, which is the latest and greatest server from Microsoft, well, then you're going to have fewer things to worry about overall. Server 2008 R2, because it's the later server operating system, is just designed to be easier for Exchange to install on top of it. Okay, so even though your inclination is to kick off the setup, as you can see here, before we do that, we have to meet those prerequisites. So one of the first things we need to do is install that filter pack. So to do that, we have to actually download the filter pack from the Microsoft website. So we'll open up our Internet Explorer, and I have already saved in favorites the location of the Windows Filter Pack. To locate it on Microsoft's website, you just go to Microsoft.com, do a search for Microsoft Filter Pack, and it will take you right to the Download Center. So here we see the 2007 Office System Converter, Microsoft Filter Pack. One of the things I wanted you to see here is that there's a 64-bit version of the filter pack. So this filter pack is not just for Exchange, but you can see there's other things that you can use the filter pack for. In our case, we're installing it for Exchange, and because we're using a 64-bit system, we want to make sure we download the 64-bit version of the filter pack. If we just take a look up here, you can see that the download works with the following programs, and it mentions quite a bit when it comes to SharePoint Server and SharePoint Services. So we click Download, and we'll save this file to our desktop. Okay, so it says Welcome to the Microsoft Filter Pack 1.0 Setup Wizard. We're taken to the Microsoft Filter Pack license, which you can read. If we just click the I accept the terms of the license agreement, we can continue. And you can see that the setup has completed. So we say OK. We close out of the Internet Explorer. And now we're going to open up PowerShell. And the first thing we're going to do is import the module using the import-module commandlet. And we're importing the Server Manager module. And you can see it's as easy as that. Once that's imported, we're going to use the Add Windows Feature commandlet. And you recall on the slide that we had a list of different items that we wanted to include here. So we're just going to go and copy those items, and then we're going to just paste them right here. And I suggest that in a real-world situation you do the same, that you have the features already mapped out, that you can copy and paste them into your PowerShell. So you can see here as we pasted it all in, it's all of the things on the slide, all of the different features that need to be installed, and it's going to take some time, and you realize that at the end it's going to restart the system. But it's also good to keep in mind that the desktop experience is included here, if you note towards the end there, and that's because we're installing the unified messaging role as well as all of the other typical roles. So again, if you're not going to install that role, then you don't have to include the desktop experience. So we hit Enter. And you can see that it's collecting data, starting the installation. This can take some time. And there you can see it's actually performing all of the various installations. It's reminding us that we have to restart the server with each one of these different features that we're installing here. And we see that the restart begins. And we're back at a logon screen. Okay, and there's one more thing we need to do here, and that is set the Net TCP port sharing service to start up automatically. Now, we can do this through PowerShell, we can do this through the command line, but in this case, let's just do something that may be a little bit more comfortable to us. Let's just open up our administrative tools, go to our services. Let's literally scroll down and look for the service right here, Net TCP port sharing service. You notice that it started, but it's set to manual startup type. If we open that, look to startup type, and then say automatic, obviously we can do it through the command line, through PowerShell, but doing it this way helps us to see exactly what we're doing by running the command line in the first place. So now that that's all done, let's actually take a look at one other thing. If we go to our Start menu, go to Documents, this is where I opened up and expanded all of my Exchange files, and so they're right in my Documents library. Again, it's up to you where you want to put them, completely up to you as far as where you're going to be most comfortable having them sit on your system, and it's temporary. Once the installation is done, you're welcome to move these or delete them. You'll notice under Scripts, though, here's the Scripts folder. If we scroll down, you remember we mentioned the Exchange typical XML file. Well, here it is right here. If we were running Server 2008 Service Pack 2, then instead of running the PowerShell commandlet to kick off the installation of all of those features, we would run the Server Manager command from our typical command prompt using the Exchange typical XML file here, and it would pretty much do the same thing. It would install all of the features that are needed in order to go forward with our Exchange installation. So at this point, we've completed all of the prerequisites for our Server 2008 R2 system. The next step is installation. If we go back to our documents and just double-click the setup file, we still have to choose the Exchange language option. And in this case, we'll just install only languages from the DVD. And now we can choose Install Microsoft Exchange. And we start with an introduction screen. We can read through the introduction of Exchange 2010. Once we're done, we click Next. It gives us the license agreement, which we're welcome to scroll down and read as well. We click I accept the terms of the license agreement and click Next. Now, error reporting is completely up to you. If you choose Yes, which is recommended, and we're going to do so here, what's going to happen is we're going to participate with Microsoft in determining where problems are coming from. So the Exchange error reporting feature will be enabled, and then we'll give feedback to Microsoft. Now here we see two different options: typical Exchange server installation and custom Exchange server installation. Let's take a moment and discuss the various server roles so that you can make a wise choice when you come to the installation type. Now, if you select typical, it will move forward and it will automatically install the hub transport, client access server, and mailbox role. However, if you select custom, it allows you to pick and choose which roles that you want to install. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. For example, the Edge Transport server cannot be installed with other roles that are on a system. In fact, it cannot even be part of the Active Directory domain. The Edge Transport server should be installed on your perimeter. The installation is slightly different from what we've been discussing here. What we're talking about here is the installation of one of the other 4 roles that Exchange offers. And those roles can all be installed together. One thing to keep in mind too is that all of these roles can be installed within a virtual machine. However, Microsoft does not approve of the unified messaging role being installed in a VM at this time. That's not to say it won't work, it's just saying that Microsoft doesn't approve of the role being installed in a VM. I've seen it work, others have seen it work, but Microsoft does not support it. Well, obviously, if we're going to do an installation of server roles, it might be a good idea to have some background as to what these roles are all about. So for starters, we have the mailbox role. This will host your users' mailboxes. If there's one role that really would be considered the most important, well, really this would be the one. Although without the client access role and the hub transport role, you wouldn't have an Exchange 2010 environment. But the mailbox server is certainly the most important. Now, beyond that, there's the client access role. This is the connection point for all of your users to their mailboxes, both internally and externally. So, MAPI connectivity, Outlook web apps, Outlook Anywhere, ActiveSync, IMAP, POP, all of that goes through your client access server role. So when you think about your mobile device and connecting up to your Exchange environment, well, that's your client access server role. When you think about an Outlook interface through your web browser using Outlook Web App, which used to be called Outlook Web Access, but now it's called Outlook Web App, well, that's your client access role that's providing that feature. In legacy environments for your Exchange, you might think of it as your front-end server. But starting with Exchange 2007, the client access server role provided the access from external contacts into your organization. Starting with Exchange 2010, it also handles the MAPI connectivity. Then we have the hub transport role. This manages the flow of traffic to and from the mailbox server. So obviously that's very important. In fact, your organization cannot function without at least one hub transport server. The unified messaging role provides a universal inbox for voicemail, email, and incoming faxes. And the edge transport server role provides a perimeter-based server to handle anti-spam and antivirus protection, as well as additional transport rules. You can install the first four roles together on a single server if you'd like. The edge transport server role cannot be installed with any of the other roles, and it must be installed on a server that's not running Active Directory. With the other four server roles, you can install these on individual systems or collectively, as we mentioned. In our case, we're going to choose a custom installation because we're going to install the mailbox, client access, and hub transport server roles all together with the unified messaging server role. Okay, so let's take a look and see how this is going to work. So now you realize that if we chose typical installation, what would happen is we would get the hub transport, client access, and mailbox server roles. But we want to, at this time, install unified messaging as well. So we'll choose custom, and then we'll select these four roles right up here at the top. We select those, and you'll notice it specifies the path for the Exchange Server program files. In this case, we're going to leave it right here on the C drive for now. It asks us about client settings and wants to know if we have any legacy clients running. Notice it says, do you have any client computers running Outlook 2003 or Entourage in your organization? Well, you recall our organization is running Outlook 2007, so the answer is no. Here it says configure client access server external domain. The client access server role will be internet facing. So we're going to select this option and we're going to put in our internet facing domain configuration. In this case, it's mail.globomantics.com. And certainly you'll want to make sure that your public DNS is aware that this specific domain name points off to this server. Now here's the Customer Experience Improvement Program. This is completely up to you if you would like to join it. It collects information about how you use Microsoft Exchange in your organization and provides that feedback to Microsoft. So in this case, we're going to join the program because anything we can do to improve Exchange is certainly something we want to be a part of, but it's your choice. You can choose not to join the program at this time. And now you'll see the system will go through all of the various readiness checks. This may take some time as it goes through and sees if this system is ready to handle all of the different roles that we've chosen. So we know we have a good server that we've installed. We know we've installed the 64-bit operating system. We know that we have all of the various prerequisites met. But what if we missed something? Well, here's where it would tell us if we missed any of the parts of the configuration that we needed to have set up. So for example, when it comes to the unified messaging role, if we did not install the desktop experience, then we would see that when it gets to the unified messaging role prerequisites, this would fail, and it would give us advice on going back and fixing the problem. And it looks like we've met all of the prerequisites. So that's exciting. So we're at the point here where we can click the install button. Let's do that. And as you can see, there's quite a number of different steps that have to take place. Some of these things will happen quickly. Some will not happen so quickly. So we're going to pause the recording at this time and come back when the installation is complete. And we're back. Okay, so it looks like we have a successful installation with no errors. We can scroll down and we can see that everything has been completed. There's an option here, finalize this installation using the Exchange Management Console. That's something I always like to do. I like to see the console come up so that I know that the installation has not only completed, but that all of the working parts are functioning and our messaging organization is alive and well. So if we click Finish, and it looks like our Exchange organization is alive and well. And as you can see, there are some post-installation tasks that are listed out for you here. so that you can get your Exchange organization completely up and running. At this point, we have our Exchange server installed with all of the server roles that we wanted, and for this video, that's as far as we wanted to go.